Furvidni, Skapa, Specky. Welcome to Evil Bedtime Stories. I'm your host, Ravendude. The following video contains strong language and dark subjects. It's also terrible, and no one should watch or listen to it, ever. If you want to support your favorite Skald of Cthulhu, shove my content down the throats of everyone you know, violently. I also have an 11-hour-long video covering my recording, editing, and pontificating like an ass over the first story I ever narrated on my channel. It's available for $1 through Patreon, Ko-fi, and YouTube channel membership at EvilBedtimeStories, linked down in the description. Thank you for joining me on my path of curiosity, creativity, and wisdom. Do you like Evil Bedtime Stories? Crystal Dancer. 35 years of horticultural fascination. 15 years of bleeding-edge laboratory analysis. Of toiling in the hostile folds between the civilized pockets on Earth's surface. Scouring every inch of inhospitable space mankind had the good sense to leave alone millennia ago. 15 years of having his hands and mind planted firmly in the dirt. Yet here he stood, deep underground. His life's work found nestled neatly between the rocks and geodes. He was right. The thought slipped from his lips before he could stop it, its flat echo tearing through the heavy silence that wrapped his discovery in a mystic room. The sharp, grayish rocks he found himself wedged between, and the humidity of his breath fogged his glasses in this pore of the earth. He removed them, almost touching the far rock face while doing so, and wiped them on his damp shirt. The sickly yellow-green of his glow stick threw an ugly haze to his bright LEDs. The haze sharpened as he reaffixed his glasses, and through stubborn splotches of sweat on his lenses, he stared at the delicate flower growing out of a dazzlingly brilliant geode. Its dark green stem whispered from between the densely packed indigo crystals, pulsing faintly with an ephemeral life unto itself. It seemed to slither slowly, dancing as the trickle of some far above stream dripped a constant lifeline onto the geodes beneath. A large, hanging bell, the rich blue-black of purest twilight sky, steamed and glistened above the dancing stem. As the specimen swayed, the drooping petals seemed to leave behind trace impressions, blurring into and out of the stagnant air itself. He smelled the fiery incense of the ghostly flower, and realized that Torbjorn did a disservice in his description. Though he could hardly fault the writer, words had failed him entirely. He fished in his cargo shorts, bringing up a rugged box with a large lens. He held the tiny thing in front of his eye, centered his shot through the viewfinder, and clicked the button on top. He stuffed the box back into his shorts, bringing out a bone-handled folding knife and a small metal jar. He readied the jar as he placed the blade against the base of the geode, hoping to dislodge the entire thing in one piece. A cold ichor oozed from under the spherical knot, black in the distorted lights. He quickly secured the geode, and more importantly, the flower in the metal jar, tying it to some hanging paracord behind him. He smiled, the dust on his lips grating as they cracked with the motion. He should have more in a year or so, if he was right. Back in his horticultural labs at the university, he set the jar next to his computer monitor and connected his rugged little box. While he waited for the files to transfer, he picked up the metal jar. Its weight reassured him, allaying his juvenile fears that his prize may have escaped or faded away. Not just the petals, but the whole damn egg. Torbjorn would be furiously jealous had the mad Swede a way to see from his crumbling grave. He twisted the lid, and in the bright fluorescent lighting he saw the flower's diaphanous dance harden, its edges crystallizing in the photonic assault. He started out of his chair, almost falling out of it, as he rushed to stop whatever decay he had started. He almost dropped it entirely, but managed to gingerly set it by his keyboard. With a trembling hand, he lit a cigarette and accessed the files from his tiny, rugged box. He noticed a video he hadn't meant to take in the caves. He erased it, silencing the sounds he wished to leave deep below the earth with the dead that made them. Poor bastard should have listened. He thought he saw the jar rattle, but decided he had just bumped the table with his leg. He checked the photos, giddy to see the flower as it was before he had stupidly exposed it to the rot above ground. Its perfect indigo seared into his bones. He heard its ghostly dance in his cells. He sat confused, staring blankly at the screen. He wasn't looking at his trophy, growing from its bed of night sky in a pocket of the earth. This whispered legend among the circles of druids and shamans for as long as memory reaches, only for he himself to wrench it from the dreams of healers long past and make them real. Instead of his panacea for all that ails, he saw what looked like the inside of a stomach. Pink flesh and sloshing fluid filled the screen. He blinked, dumbly. It made no sense. Then again, things had stopped making sense pretty much exactly as he found himself bashing a rock into his research assistant's skull down in the caves. Or had he? He still wasn't sure. He had to go back and double check. He had to take another look at his prize. Its beckoning dance burned in his soul, whispering sweetly for him to join the loam. He saw the rattling this time. Excerpt from the Ravenhov University news release, September 9th, 2024. The university still reels after the loss of Professor Timmons. His 15-year legacy in our horticultural and biological labs has raised our knowledge of extremophiles to monumental proportions. Professor Timmons, Ravenov's own Indiana Jones, discovered an astounding 46 distinct new species of extremophiles, most with the help of technology developed here on campus. His most recent trip to Australia in search of his proposed crystal dancer saw a promising new scope of possibilities in the medical and engineering sectors, making his sudden passing even more shocking. Investigators are still on the search for whomever attacked Professor Timmons in his laboratory. In an official press statement, the university's chief of security stated, "This assault was obviously premeditated. Camera footage has been tampered with, and someone has spent a painstaking amount of time creating an obviously fabricated account of the events between 7:35 and 9:56 p.m. Thursday night. To address the rumors, there is no evidence as of yet that Professor Timmons' discovery played any part in what happened. I think it goes without saying there should be no fear of exotic, head-eating flowers on campus. The East Wing will reopen at the end of the week. Please report any signs of pollen in the surrounding areas." Below the ground, in darkest blackness, wrapped tightly by the grayish stone walls, a body lays in gentle repose. Its skull caved in, the blood long dried. The slow flow of mineral water from the walls collected in pools inside the fragments of bone, making the small blooms of blue crystal slick in the inky black. Much, much deeper, in a yawning pocket of sharpened stone lined with crystal trees of twinkling night, a new bundle of gossamer indigo petals opens upon the grandmother's stem. In the loam of her embrace, Arthur Temmons' skull added its screams of anguish to the undying chorus, harmonizing hideously with the skull of his research assistant. Through the pounding pressure, behind the neural torture, he felt her pollen in his lab. He felt her preparing for another, much more substantial bloom. His screams sharpened, and the grandmother danced faster in the inky blackness. Ipsissimus. The steady hum of the amber lights seared holes in the crumbling ochre tiles lining the room. Each small tile distorted the constant whine, sharpening its edge to cut deeper into his brain. His skin clung to the dark metal of the tub, made viscous by the gray sludge inside. His cruel bindings bit into him all over his body. The needles and tubing caught and twisted in his skin every time he so much as twitched. The gray slime was itchy, and he was sure he could feel it seeping into him through his wounds. It felt like the bugs under his skin were chewing on the needles in his skull. He blinked his eyes, suddenly aware that he was regrettably conscious again, staring at those dingy, yellow tiles. His throat blazed with fire as he turned his head, almost gagging on the feeding tube. He looked at the dark metal of the other tub, at the dry, flaky skin of the corpse that lay within, its tangled knot of wires and tubing growing out of its skull. Down the tub like a parasitic nightmare from a Victorian-era hospital, it trailed away and out of his sight. There was a small screen beside the tubes, cracked and flickering out a cold blue light behind a frowning face. He looked at the corpse, its body laden with needles, wires, and tubing, and felt the mirrors for each and every one reflected in his own flesh. He wondered if the thick cords leading from the back of his skull dripped the same oily mucus. How long it would take his skin to dry out like that. How long he'd get to sleep next time and dream, escape, play his games, talk with friends, with her. The cold screens fluttered and clicked, switching to a cartoonish outline of a roasted chicken on a plate, complete with steam lines rising from the grunge of the screen. He felt a tear form at the corner of his eye. He knew he wasn't strong enough to fight feeding time. The rigid mouthguard affixed around his feeding tube bore no signs of his many struggles, and his bindings gripped as firm as ever. It was he who was breaking, his defining ties that were melting away. There was a distant rattle behind him, and the feeding tube undulated slowly. A snake, swallowed and sitting deep in his stomach, regurgitating He watched the gray sludge, thick with dark chunks, ooze its way up the tube, running from the base of the tub and into his mouth. He hated the lukewarm slime he felt on his lips at feeding time. He He hated how the heavy muck writhed in his gut. But most of all, he hated how little they gave him. His heart began to race, his fingers and toes twitching. He felt the sludge in the tub pulse as it itched its way into his skin. His eyes began to seize and he struggled for breath around the tubing in his throat. The buzzing of the lights rose to a sledgehammering inside his ears, and the cord at the base of his skull oozed magma into his nerve endings. The tiny yellow tiles vibrated with his weak mewlings of pain, throwing them back in distorted mockeries. As his spine swelled to the point of burst, the edges of the room began to fuzz out, and he slipped into a blissful blackness in which there were no needles, no tubes, no vicious yellow. Only her face and the promise that it bore. The mangy yellow of the tiles burned into his weak eyes, and in the hum of the lights there was a faint, rhythmic squeak and rattle. He prayed for sleep, but knew it wouldn't come in time. What seemed like an eternity brought the squat thing in its wheelchair, with its rolling table, all rust and sharp corners, close in tow behind. The thing grumbled under its breath, lifting a thick arm to yank at the cords of the papery corpse next to him. They squelched and clattered onto the tiny yellow tiles below the dark metal tub. The thing hefted itself in its chair to get a grip around the body and dumped it onto the table. Strands of gray trailed from the table to the tub like viscous spider threads in the amber light. The smell was heavy, settling into his stomach, making him retch. The thing started in its chair, having been seemingly oblivious of the watchful eye behind it. It grunted, bringing its leathery face close to his. He could smell a sickly sweet rot seeping from between the deep lines and cracks in its ogreish face. It had wild eyes, one low and heavy-lidded, the other wide and frenzied. Both were an angry flax, and in the frantic assessment of its bulging eye he saw a shimmering green ringing its pupils. The thing grunted dismissively, turning back to its work. He watched as the chair-bound thing strapped the body into the table, bundled up the tubing, needles and wires, tossing them into the now draining tub. The slush gurgled horridly as the chair and table squeaked its way back down the hall. He shuddered, again flaring his body with pain against his cruel condition. He couldn't help himself. He could do nothing but lay there and wait his turn. He watched the tiles blur together, and a little while later, there was a fresh batch accompanying the rumbling of his feeding tube. The sludge was much warmer than the last time, and he wondered, through his maddening calm, how long this one would last. There was a new one. Her hair was limp, brown, and hung in tatters. He couldn't tell if she had been pretty once, through the tangled mess newly affixed to her. Her skin was pink in the amber hue, tender from the sculpting of the thing in the chair. She didn't move, not on her own, at least. Her chest heaved with the painful rhythm of some machine hooked into her. He wasn't sure how long she had been there for, but he knew that he hoped she wouldn't wake into this nightmare. He hated it enough for the both of them. Feeding times were rough for the both of them, though he never saw her even so much as twitch. The squeaking echoed slowly behind him, sharpening the mold growing on the little yellow tiles of the room. She still hadn't moved, even after 9 feeding cycles. He watched as the thing muscled its chair over to her side. It turned a faucet hidden under the bundles of grimy tubing, coughing out thick gray sludge into the tube. The thing dipped its hands in it, smearing a fetid streak across the back of its bald, lumpy skull. He watched as the thing fished a metallic strand from under the ichor in her tub. It looked at the sharp end of the cable, gleaming slickly in the gray ooze a warm, twisting light. He watched as the thing took a moment to steel itself, feeling at the anointed patch of skull. He watched it bring its hand up and plunge the cable into its flesh, its crunching bone echoing in his teeth. The thing in the chair let out a disgusting squeal, crumpling out of its chair and onto the tiny, mocking tiles on the floor. The sounds of its struggles brought fire to the inside of his brain, and he strained with all his wasting might against his restraints. He raged with a passion tapped straight into the primal recesses of humanity, a passion reserved for a parent defending the life of their child with their very own. He needed to care for this wretched creature. Through brutal experiment, his instincts for love and protection had been hijacked and hardwired beyond his control. He saw the thing shudder against the cold of the vicious tile floor, and felt his spine protesting at his strain. He felt his skin splitting under the gray ooze, letting it writhe its way further into him. He screamed. A muffled scream stifled by the feeding tube. It was joined by the rising hum of the amber lights, building pressure in his head. And just before he felt it would finally, blissfully burst, he saw her stand. She was radiating, bedecked in her crown of tubing. Her skin dripped with the gray ooze, and as she stepped out of the tub, he watched as it melted into the ochre tiles, leaving an oil-slick rainbow sheen that warped the light painfully. She was beautifully horrifying, her bones igniting crystalline reflections in the smiling little tiles. They sang the echoes of her thoughts, charging the air with a ringing pressure on every ragged breath. Their mother had finally been set free, and he had just enough left in him to witness it. He watched her lithe form stoop down, cradling the fading crumple that was her most loyal son. Its skin vibrated at her touch, unraveling in wet spirals on the floor. He watched as she tenderly picked pristine bones out of the offal, placing them reverently into the pool that was the tub. He felt hot tears come to his eyes. Everything they had been through, all the doubt, all the death, generations of effort, uncountable riches invested, technologies designed, blood shed, lives ruined. It had all been worth it. Their group had built her a gateway of blood and sinew, sewn together in synapse, crystal, and fear. Generations and generations. Finally, she was here, and she would right the wrongs of the world. The hum of the lighting flared. The dingy ochre tiles deepened, folding in on themselves in disturbing patterns, revealing a blinding light that was a truer, more passionate color than the tiles. It filled everything. The velvet light of her presence melting the lines that define. He heard the frenzied strings of strange instruments mixing with the smoldering light. She would bring it here. That dream city of Gana, its mad spires twinkling, its denizens screaming in its intricate cobblestone streets. She would bring it here, and the world would be shown its true king. He smiled and waited for her loving embrace to forget him from the very fabric of the world. Kudzu. His mother had always told him not to play in the thick vines, but they were everywhere. Fat, flat leaves throwing a hostile shade on anything caught beneath the voracious growth wound their way over anything that didn't actively keep them back. Along the swales in the road, up the power lines on his street, he heard Jacob down the block had seen a vine snatch a swallow clear out of the sky. "Ate it whole and spat the bones," he said. In the gilded thrum of the afternoon cicadas, held tightly by the golden rays of the dying sun, he scoffed at Jacob, always making up stories. Told him one time if he stepped on a crack his mother would die screaming. Jacob was weird. Funny, though. He looked over his shoulder, through the sliding glass door and into the kitchen. He saw his mother cooking what she called her signature pot roast. He didn't know what was so signature about a can of Dinty Moore on toast with cheese, but he loved it all the same. His stomach rumbled. Looking back at the manicured lawn, each blade so prim, proper, and in its place, seemed almost alien when put against the backdrop of those thick vines. He liked them in summer. You couldn't see into the house from across the street, and it kept the sun out for half the day. In the winters, it all died back, brittle and gray. There was nothing special about them then, just a huge mess. No monsters waiting to grab you, no snakes waiting to bite. Still, he swore he could see it trying to overtake the lawn, like slow serpents, poised for the moment they let their guard down. He felt a chill run through him, sat up and ran inside. Stupid Jacob. In an Aeonian room, beneath the veneered siding of suburbia, a thin, haggard man carried a wet bundle in his hands. 9 of 12. He moved with a strange calm, often stopping to appreciate the cracked cement and the vines that spread from them. He thought they looked like the most beautiful veins and arteries on the planet. He could almost see the faint pulse sent through each and every one, letting him know he was doing the right thing. He reached a withered hand out to the living wall, stopping just short of caressing a tall stem filled with hundreds of twinkling blue flowers. His rotting corneas affixed on a silvery glow that bobbed and weaved in the space before him, drawing his attention back towards the trail. The silver glow winked lazily as it kept his gaze, pulling him along dumbly. Slowly, his decaying frame brought him before the pit. He scratched at the thick petals growing from the back of his skull, tracing a finger around their bulbous center. He was pretty sure that wasn't good. He caught sight of that silver glow again, swirling lazily in the gloam of his ruined basement. He dropped the bundle on the thick vegetation, having lost control of his hands. He hit the moist ground soon after, seizing violently as the petals curled in on themselves. An eternity of pure agony, and the brain flower puffed out a thick plume of noxious spores. 9 out of 12. He figured that was good enough. The echoing rumble from deep within the pit lulled him to sleep, promising a reunion with his Jacob. He didn't know why everyone was acting all weird. Jacob's family probably just moved. He didn't know why them being gone would mess with school, but he didn't really care. He did care about not having power, though. He hated not being able to play his games. It was so boring outside. And hot. Looking out over his manicured lawn, he saw the hanging tendrils sway in the wind. Jacob was so weird, always making up stories. He looked back through the sliding glass door, at the dark house beyond it. He sighed to himself, the whine of the southern summer filling the silence of his thoughts. The golden warmth of the afternoon stood stark against that dark green canopy, thick with vine, leaf, and shade. Stupid Jacob. He threw a rock into the vines, turning away from the silvery glow that winked patiently in their grasp. Thanks for sticking around. Subscribe to the Mad Horde. Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Like this stupid video. Let the algorithm gods know we exist. Chuck $1 my way and get access to an insulting amount of my special brand of idiocy. Or maybe a little more and get some really cool stuff I make by hand. I'll see you in the next one. Vini miro then.